I used to think the coldest thing in the world was a Denver blizzard. I was wrong. The absolute coldest thing is the lifeless ping of a bank notification echoing in the dark. It was a transfer for $100. I was trapped inside a crushed car at the bottom of a ravine, bleeding out, desperately begging the man I called my husband to save my life. Soon, I would learn how to make his money scream. Hello, wonderful listeners of Violet Revenge Stories. We pour our hearts into these tales, but unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with zero operating budget. If you find today's story captivating, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking team to survive and keep creating these stories for you. You can easily support us by scanning the QR code on your screen or clicking the donation link in the description or pinned comment below. My name is Quinn Brooks, and this is my story. The night before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, I was not dreaming of white lace or eternal promises. I was standing under the harsh fluorescent lights of Denver General Hospital, listening to a cardiologist deliver a death sentence. My mother's heart was failing rapidly, and the only thing standing between her and a life-saving surgery was an emergency deposit of $50,000. I did not have it. My own modest savings had been completely drained by her previous treatments. In a state of absolute, breathless panic, I turned to the only person in the world who could pull us back from the brink. I called my fiancé, Julian Vance. Julian was the golden boy of the Denver Tech Valley. He was a rising chief executive officer whose wealth was multiplying by the minute, a man who could spend $50,000 on a vintage watch without blinking. When I rushed to his penthouse and begged him for the money to save my mother, he did not pull me into his arms. He did not assure me that everything would be fine. He simply stared at me from across his cold marble kitchen island, his eyes entirely devoid of warmth. He reluctantly agreed to wire the funds to the hospital, but the air in the room had irreparably changed. The fatal damage was done, and the seed of doubt had been expertly planted by Sloan Mercer. Sloan was the chief financial officer of Julian's company, a sharp, ruthless woman whose ambition was only matched by her blatant disdain for me. She had always coveted my place by Julian's side, constantly hovering in the periphery of our relationship. Later that same night, Sloan whispered pure poison into his ear. She convinced Julian that the medical emergency was simply too perfectly timed. She told him I was nothing more than a parasite, a calculating gold digger securing a massive payout right before signing the marriage license. Julian, blinded by his own toxic pride and heavily influenced by Sloane's manipulative logic, chose to believe her twisted narrative. After that night, our marriage was never a union of two souls. It was a suffocating prison sentence. The tender, affectionate man I thought I knew vanished completely, replaced by a warden who looked at me with nothing but raw, undisguised contempt. The grand, glass-walled mansion we moved into up on the hills became a beautiful, terrifying cage. His most brutal weapon against me was not physical violence. It was a ruthless, crushing system of financial control. He immediately cut off my access to our joint accounts. He isolated me, making sure I knew exactly who held all the power in our home. The true depth of my humiliation, however, was written in digital ink. Life inevitably brought relentless expenses. My mother required constant follow-up appointments, expensive daily medications, and specialized home care. My old car frequently broke down in the freezing winter weather, requiring sudden repairs just so I could get to work. Whenever I was forced to swallow my pride and ask Julian for financial help, he never answered me with his voice. The sprawling house would be dead silent, save for the sharp, lifeless ping of a bank notification on my phone. I would look down at the glowing screen to see a transfer for exactly $100. Attached to these pitiful, agonizing sums were sarcastic, degrading memos typed out by my own husband. Sometimes the note would simply read, "Tip." Other times it said, "Hush money," or "Charity." It was his sick, psychological game, a daily method of reminding me that in his eyes, I was entirely worthless, a beggar surviving only on his reluctant scraps. People on the outside often wonder why a woman stays in such a degrading nightmare. My reason was pure survival. I held a highly sensitive, intensely demanding data research position at Vespera Dynamics. It was a strict corporate job that required a flawless background check and impeccable internal security clearance. The organization severely frowned upon personal instability, and a sudden, explosive divorce from a prominent tech figure like Julian would have triggered a devastating internal security review. I could not risk losing my career. I desperately needed the income to keep the fragile shell of my life intact. I had to maintain the perfect, polished facade of a stable family to protect my clearance, all while bearing the agonizing, solitary burden of caring for my dying mother. Every single day I absorbed the poison of his $100 insults, silently gathering the bitter ashes of my dignity, completely unaware of the deadly storm rapidly approaching. We existed as two silent ghosts haunting a sprawling, multi-million-dollar architectural masterpiece. The glass mansion perched high in the Denver hills was perfectly designed to catch every single ounce of natural sunlight, yet it remained the absolute coldest place on Earth. Julian and I shared a roof, but we occupied entirely different universes. As his company valuations skyrocketed, he completely stopped pretending I existed. The tech industry thrives on polished optics and carefully curated public relations, but immense power creates its own distorted reality. Julian began openly escorting Sloan Mercer to elite industry galas, high-profile venture capital dinners, and exclusive weekend retreats. I, the legal wife, was relegated to a mere shadow, an inconvenient footnote fading into the background of his rapidly expanding empire. He would leave for black tie events with Sloan draped triumphantly on his arm, the scent of her heavy, expensive perfume lingering in our massive foyer, while I stayed behind, tracing the winter frost on the floor-to-ceiling windows. The hypocrisy of this silicone elite peaked at the annual winter charity auction. It was a grotesque, glittering display of extreme wealth masquerading as philanthropy, held at the most exclusive country club in the state. I was required to attend strictly for the sake of corporate photographs, forced to wear a stifling designer gown and maintain a frozen, agreeable smile. The grand ballroom was a sea of dark velvet and blinding diamonds, buzzing with loud conversations about startup valuations, offshore tax havens, and private aviation. The auctioneer was currently taking bids for a private yacht tour in the Mediterranean, the numbers climbing effortlessly into the hundreds of thousands. I stood alone near a towering ice sculpture in the corner, trying desperately to remain invisible. That was when Sloan found me. She did not approach alone. She was flanked by a small group of prominent tech wives, women whose loyalties and friendships shifted based entirely on current stock prices and net worth. Sloan held a delicate crystal flute of champagne, her eyes gleaming with predatory delight. "Quinn, darling," Sloan said, her voice expertly pitched to slice cleanly through the ambient noise of the string quartet. "You look absolutely exhausted. Is the stress of being a constant financial burden finally taking its toll on you?" The other women offered polite, synchronized chuckles, sipping their drinks and watching me like a caged animal. Sloan stepped closer, aggressively invading my personal space. "Julian was just telling us all about your mother," Sloan continued, her tone dripping with mock sympathy. "It is truly tragic, really, but in the venture capital world, we have to recognize when we are pouring precious capital into a sinking ship. Honestly, keeping that woman alive on machines has been Julian's absolute worst return on investment. You really should learn when to cut your losses." The sheer, breathtaking cruelty of reducing a human life to a failed financial asset left me completely paralyzed. I gripped my evening clutch so hard my fingers turned entirely white, forcing myself to swallow the bitter bile rising in my throat. I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me cry in front of these vultures. Before I could formulate a coherent response, the heavy vibration of my phone shattered the tense moment. It was a sharp, frantic, continuous pattern. The caller identification displayed the intensive care unit of the hospital. I immediately turned my back on Sloan and the snickering wives, pressing the device hard against my ear. The voice on the other end belonged to my mother's primary night nurse, and her tone was laced with raw, unadulterated urgency. My mother had just suffered a massive, catastrophic complication. Her failing heart was giving out completely. The local medical team had exhausted every single available option in their facility. The nurse explicitly stated that my mother needed an immediate medical evacuation helicopter flight to a specialized surgical center in Seattle. If she did not get on a private medical flight within the next 2 hours, she absolutely would not survive the night. The glittering ballroom tilted violently on its axis. The classical music echoing through the grand hall faded into a deafening, ringing static. I needed a private medical charter immediately, a specialized service that required a massive, instantaneous cash retainer that only my husband could authorize. I frantically pushed my way through the dense crowd of billionaires and socialites, ignoring the annoyed glares as my dress caught on their chairs. My eyes darted wildly, scanning the room for Julian's custom-tailored tuxedo. I finally spotted him near the heavy oak doors of the VIP lounge, holding court with a group of major investors. I lunged forward, desperate to reach him, but a solid wall of dark fabric and muscle blocked my path. 2 private security contractors stepped directly in front of me, their expressions completely blank and unyielding. One of them held up a large, gloved hand. "I am sorry, ma'am," the guard stated mechanically. "Ms. Mercer gave explicit, strict instructions that Mr. Vance is absolutely not to be disturbed during this specific negotiation." I argued frantically. I pleaded with them. I explained that I was his wife, and it was a literal matter of life and death. But they remained as immovable as stone statues, their orders superseding my panic, trembling and gasping for air. I retreated to a quiet, shadowed alcove near the restrooms and dialed Julian's private cellular number. I called him 1 time. I called him 5 times. I called him 12 times in a row. Every single attempt went straight to his silent, hollow voicemail. I was pacing the small area like a trapped animal, hot tears finally blurring my vision as the precious, life-saving minutes drained away into nothingness. Finally, the dark screen of my phone lit up, illuminating my tear-stained hands. It was not an incoming call. It was the familiar, soul-crushing notification from our joint banking application. A digital deposit had just cleared. I stared at the glowing pixels, my breath hitching painfully in my chest. Julian had transferred exactly $100 into my account. Attached to that miserable, insulting sum was a short, typed memo. It read, "Do not ruin my party with your cheap drama." The desperate shrill of my ringing phone echoed in the dark hallway. It was the hospital. Time had completely run out. I immediately dialed 911. A pre-recorded robotic voice echoed through the receiver, coldly informing me that emergency dispatch lines were completely overwhelmed. The worst blizzard in 50 years was currently battering the state. All rescue vehicles were grounded. I checked my bank account balance. It displayed exactly $0.00. Without Julian authorizing the funds, a private medical helicopter was an absolute impossibility. I had only one single option left. I had to physically reach the hospital, sign the emergency liability waiver, and force the state to release a medevac. I grabbed my keys and sprinted into the freezing night. The wind slashed at my face like icy razors. I forced myself into my old sedan and turned the ignition. I drove straight toward the closed mountain pass. Massive digital highway signs flashed bright orange warnings, commanding every single driver to turn back. The roads were officially blocked. I ignored the warnings. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal. The storm was a solid white wall of furious snow. The wipers whipped frantically back and forth but could barely move the heavy sludge. I was navigating entirely blind on sheets of invisible black ice. My tires slipped and gripped, battling the treacherous incline. Every muscle in my body was completely rigid. I kept whispering prayers into the empty car. I just needed to reach the city. Suddenly, blinding white headlights flared in my rearview mirror. They pierced the thick, swirling snow with terrifying intensity. A massive, lifted black sport utility vehicle materialized right out of the storm. It was moving way too fast for the lethal conditions. The massive grille rode my rear bumper, separated by mere inches of freezing air. I tapped my brakes very lightly to warn the driver to back off. The black vehicle did not slow down. It surged violently forward. Metal smashed into metal. The violent impact sent a terrifying, bone-rattling shudder through my steering column. My neck snapped sharply backward. I fought the wheel, desperately trying to keep the tires on the asphalt. I hit the accelerator to create distance. The black vehicle matched my exact speed. We were hurtling recklessly down a steep, winding gorge. The icy road curved sharply to the left, hugging a fatal drop. The black vehicle swerved intentionally. It violently clipped my rear right quarter panel. I lost all traction. The world spun wildly out of control. The tires screeched against the ice. Metal shrieked and tore as my car slammed sideways into the steel guardrail. The old, rusted barrier gave way instantly. Gravity violently seized my car. We launched off the sheer cliff edge and plunged directly into the absolute blackness of the ravine. The descent was pure chaos. The car rolled over and over. Glass exploded inward like shrapnel. The roof caved violently downward. The heavy engine block shifted and crushed into the cabin. A deafening crunch of metal filled the air, followed immediately by absolute, crushing silence. Cold, numbing, brutal, relentless cold. I slowly opened my eyes. The dashboard was a mangled, unrecognizable mess of torn wires and jagged plastic. The heavy, nauseating stench of raw gasoline and warm copper flooded my lungs. I attempted to shift my weight. A guttural scream ripped violently from my bleeding throat. My right leg was securely pinned beneath the collapsed steering column. The bone was completely shattered. I looked down through the darkness. The driver's seat was heavily soaked in a thick, dark crimson liquid. My own blood was pooling rapidly on the frozen floorboards. I was bleeding out. My hands shook violently. My fingers were completely numb. I dug frantically through the scattered debris. I found my phone wedged beneath the shattered windshield. The screen was badly cracked, spreading like a spiderweb across the glass, but the backlight was still glowing. I had zero cellular service for a standard voice call. The storm blocked everything. I managed to connect to a very weak, intermittent satellite data network. I opened my messaging application. I held down the audio recording button with a trembling, bloody thumb. I screamed into the tiny microphone. I begged Julian. I pleaded with him to use his massive wealth, his boundless influence, his private security contractors, anything to send a rescue chopper. I sent the voice message. I hit record again. I sent another. I sent 45 consecutive voice messages into the digital void. My voice grew progressively weaker, cracking and fading with every single recording. I was crying uncontrollably. I told him I was dying. I told him my leg was crushed. I begged him to save my mother. I bargained with him, offering to disappear completely from his life forever if he would just send help. The data network buffered slowly, then violently refreshed my social media feed. At the very top of the cracked screen, a bright pink live broadcast ring flashed vividly. It was Sloan. My bloody finger accidentally tapped the glowing circle. The live video immediately loaded. The bright, high-definition image on the screen was physically sickening. Warm, golden light flooded a massive, luxurious room from a giant crystal chandelier. Julian stood directly in the center of the frame. His tailored suit was perfectly pressed. His hair was impeccably styled. A bright, triumphant smile was plastered across his handsome face. He held a massive, dark green bottle of vintage champagne. A crowd of wealthy investors cheered wildly in the background. He popped the cork. Golden liquid sprayed high into the air. He had just successfully closed a multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition. Sloan turned the front-facing camera toward her own face, laughing loudly, her eyes shining with absolute victory. The booming, joyful party music and the roaring cheers echoed from my tiny, cracked speaker. The sounds of their glorious celebration completely drowned out the horrific sound of the freezing wind howling through my shattered car windows. He was basking in the glow of total victory, while I was trapped in a metal coffin, choking on my own blood. My vision began to blur violently at the edges. The agonizing, fiery pain in my crushed leg slowly dissolved into a terrifying, heavy numbness. The cold was finally winning. The phone vibrated sharply in my bloody palm. A new, bright notification slid down from the very top of the shattered screen. It was an automated email from our joint bank account. I held my ragged breath. My heart leaped with a sudden, desperate surge of hope. A rescue team. He finally heard the messages. He was sending a rescue team. I forced my heavy eyelids open to read the screen. The bold black text burned into my fading retinas. A digital deposit had just successfully cleared into my account. It was exactly $100. Attached to the meager sum was a short typed transaction memo. It read, "Tow truck service fee, stop lying." The glowing screen flickered violently. The low battery indicator flashed red one single time. The screen died completely. Total, impenetrable darkness consumed the ruined cabin. The freezing mountain air seeped deep into my shattered bones, instantly freezing the warm tears as they rolled down my bruised face. I slowly closed my eyes. My breathing grew incredibly shallow. I knew the devastating, absolute truth deep in my core. My mother had already taken her final, agonizing breath in a sterile, lonely hospital room miles away. No rescue team was ever coming for me. I surrendered my broken body to the heavy, silent snow, waiting patiently for the dark abyss to finally claim my life. I did not die in the ravine. I floated in a heavy, dreamless void for 4 entire days before the harsh fluorescent lights of a hospital room forced my eyelids open. I was completely immobilized, hooked to a chorus of rhythmically beeping monitors. A state highway patrol unit had miraculously spotted the metallic reflection of my crushed bumper buried under the snowbanks while clearing the gorge. The attending physician stood at the foot of my bed. His face carried the heavy, practiced sympathy of a man about to deliver a devastating blow. He informed me that my mother had passed away during the height of the blizzard. Her failing heart had simply stopped while I was bleeding out on the ice. He then pointed to my right leg, which was heavily suspended and wrapped in thick white plaster. The bone had been completely pulverized. Surgeons had rebuilt it using titanium plates and heavy screws. I would keep my leg, but the doctor bluntly stated that I would walk with a severe limp and rely on heavy wooden crutches for the rest of my life. When the doctor left, the sterile room plunged into absolute silence. The tears did not come. The overwhelming, suffocating grief that should have broken me simply evaporated, replaced by a strange, hollow clarity. The heavy wooden door creaked open. Julian stepped into the room. He looked entirely different from the triumphant, champagne-soaked conqueror I had seen on the glowing screen. He looked haggard, his expensive clothes wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot and darting nervously. The local police department had called him to verify the catastrophic wreckage, officially shattering his comfortable delusion that I was merely creating cheap drama. The reality of the twisted steel and my near-fatal injuries had cracked his arrogant shell. He approached my bed slowly, reaching out a trembling hand to touch my heavily bruised arm. "Quinn," Julian whispered, his voice cracking with a pathetic, manufactured tremor. "I am so sorry. I swear to you, I had absolutely no idea it was this serious. The storm was so bad. I thought you were just exaggerating to get my attention. We will get you the best physical therapists in the country. I will pay for everything." I did not scream. I did not hurl insults or beg for an explanation. I slowly turned my head and looked directly into his eyes. All the warmth, all the desperate love I once held for this man had frozen solid. My gaze was as sharp and dead as the black ice that had nearly killed me. "Take your hand off me," I said. My voice was a flat, unrecognizable whisper. "I do not want a single cent of your money. Get out of my room." Julian flinched as if I had physically struck him. He opened his mouth to argue, but the absolute void in my expression silenced him. He slowly backed away, turned, and fled the room like a coward. 3 days later, the true nature of my tragedy was revealed. A senior network architect from my division at Vespera Dynamics slipped quietly into my hospital room after visiting ours. We had worked closely on several classified data security projects. He looked highly paranoid, quickly closing the blinds before handing me a thick, unmarked manila folder. He had run a covert diagnostic on my ruined vehicle after the insurance adjusters pulled the wreckage from the ravine. It was a hidden telemetry report. My crash was not an accident caused by severe weather. The onboard computer data definitively proved that my electronic braking system had been maliciously disabled via a remote wireless override. Someone had hacked into my vehicle mainframe precisely when I was navigating the most dangerous curve of the mountain pass. The engineer pointed to a highlighted line of code on the final page. The digital footprint was remarkably sophisticated, but it left a faint, undeniable Internet Protocol address. The trace led directly back to the secure, encrypted corporate servers of Julian's technology firm. The final piece of the puzzle snapped violently into place. The aggressive black sport utility vehicle, the complete failure of my brakes, Sloane Mercer and her relentless ambition, the devastating realization washed over me. This was an orchestrated execution. In that sterile hospital bed, the terrified, compliant wife died completely. From her ashes, something utterly monstrous and perfectly cold was born. The agonizing pain in my shattered leg instantly crystallized into a brilliant, blinding fire of absolute vengeance. I sat up and carefully reviewed my arsenal. I had the 45 unopened, desperate voice messages. I had the official medical certificate declaring the exact hour of my mother's lonely death. I had the humiliating banking records showing dozens of mocking $100 transfers. And now, I possessed the damning server logs proving attempted murder. They thought they had buried a fragile, helpless woman in the snow. They were about to discover they had merely sharpened a lethal blade. The real game had just begun. I swallowed my profound revulsion and played the role of the perfect, broken victim. I returned to the sprawling glass mansion heavily reliant on my new wooden crutches. Every single step I took was a carefully calculated display of pathetic vulnerability. I kept my head down, dragging my injured leg, intentionally looking completely defeated. Julian exhaled a massive, visible sigh of relief when I hobbled through the heavy oak front door. In his incredibly arrogant mind, a physically disabled woman who had just buried her only family member was permanently trapped. He firmly believed I was no longer a flight risk or a financial liability. I was simply a tragic, dependent creature who needed his shelter. His paranoia dissolved entirely. He stopped locking his secure home office. He carelessly left his personal devices charging on the kitchen island. He gave me the exact opening I needed to dismantle his entire life. Late at night, while Julian was deeply asleep in the master bedroom, I sat in the dark, silent living room and went to work. I bypassed the advanced home network security protocols with effortless, surgical precision, utilizing the heavy penetration algorithms I utilize daily at Vespera Dynamics. I silently mirrored his encrypted personal laptop drive directly to my secure, isolated terminal. The massive data extraction took exactly 3 hours. What I uncovered in those digital archives was a terrifying labyrinth of corporate rot and sheer sociopathic greed. I first opened the master source file for his highly anticipated new product launch. This was the revolutionary technology that was supposedly going to double his company valuation by the end of the fiscal quarter. As I scanned the foundational architecture of the code, my blood ran absolutely cold. It was not a brilliant new innovation birthed by his engineering team. It was a direct, line-by-line copy of my own classified data modeling project from Vespera Dynamics. Julian had not just ignored my dying mother. He was building his entire tech empire by blatantly stealing my intellectual property right out of my home office network. I dug deeper into the encrypted communication logs, hunting for the true depths of the betrayal. The second discovery was far more sickening. Sloane Mercer was not just a homicidal mistress trying to secure a wedding ring. She was systematically bleeding his company dry from the inside out. I found hidden offshore routing numbers, falsified vendor invoices, and phantom accounts proving she had brazenly embezzled over $7 million from the corporate treasury. She had cleverly pinned the missing funds on 3 independent defense contractors. The most disturbing part was a heavily archived email chain between the two of them. Julian had definitively discovered the massive financial discrepancies over 6 months ago. Instead of reporting her to the federal authorities, he turned a blind eye, heavily manipulated by her toxic charm and entirely paralyzed by the massive public scandal it would cause his upcoming product launch. But Sloane possessed an ambition that was absolute and bloodthirsty. In a deeply hidden subfolder labeled with a generic administrative title, I found the digital fingerprint of the assassination order. Sloane had personally utilized company funds to purchase the black market exploit used to fry my vehicle computer. She was the one who issued the remote kill command to my electronic braking system. The afternoon before his massive press conference, I called Julian and asked him to meet me at a quiet, isolated coffee shop on the very edge of the city. He arrived looking highly stressed but aggressively confident, clearly expecting another tearful, pathetic plea for his emotional support. I did not order a drink. I did not shed a single tear. I simply reached into my heavy winter coat pocket and pulled out a thick stack of pristine white envelopes. I methodically placed 45 individual envelopes on the small wooden table between us. Each one contained a single, crisp bill of exactly $100. I looked at him with absolute, terrifying emptiness. "This is the full refund for the 45 voicemails you intentionally ignored while I was bleeding to death," I said. My voice was completely devoid of any human emotion. The color drained entirely from Julian's face. He stared at the $4,500 spread across the table like it was venomous. The crushing, undeniable weight of reality finally shattered his arrogant delusion. He suddenly collapsed forward, covering his face with his trembling hands, sobbing loudly and practically begging for my forgiveness. He swore he would change. I simply grabbed my wooden crutches, turned my back, and walked out the door without looking back. Before I even reached the sidewalk, I heard his panicked, breathless gasp echoing through the cafe window. He had just opened his phone to check his emails, only to find a critical security alert flashing in bright red text. Every single administrative password to his entire corporate infrastructure had just been changed. The product launch was the undeniable crown jewel of the Denver Tech Calendar. Held at the colossal downtown convention center, the sprawling auditorium was packed shoulder to shoulder with hundreds of the most ruthless venture capitalists and heavy-hitting angel investors in the United States. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the electric buzz of anticipated wealth. This was the exact pinnacle Julian and Sloane had bled their company dry to achieve. The massive stage was sleek, bathed in dramatic blue spotlights, projecting an aura of unstoppable innovation. Julian strode confidently to the center of the stage. He wore a custom-tailored midnight blue suit, flashing his signature blinding smile to the applauding crowd. He raised his hands to quiet the room, completely ready to unveil the stolen core technology that would secure his legacy and billions in funding. He opened his mouth to speak, but the microphone let out a deafening screech of static. The colossal high-definition screens behind him flickered violently and suddenly went completely black. The corporate branding vanished. A heavy, confused murmur rippled through the elite audience. Then, a single, horrifying image illuminated the massive display. It was a high-resolution photograph of my mangled, blood-soaked sedan crushed at the bottom of the frozen rocky ravine. Before anyone could process the gruesome sight, the state-of-the-art surround sound system roared to life. My own voice echoed through the cavernous hall. It was the raw, unedited recording of the desperate, agonizing screams from my 45 ignored voicemails, the guttural sounds of my sobbing, begging for my mother's life while choking on my own blood, completely paralyzed the hundreds of investors. The heavy velvet curtains at the side of the stage parted. I stepped out of the shadows, the rhythmic, heavy thud of my wooden crutches hitting the polished floorboards was the only sound cutting through the stunned silence. Every single camera lens pivoted toward me. I walked deliberately into the harsh stage lights, standing just a few feet away from my trembling husband. With a single press of a button on my remote, the massive screen shifted again. It displayed a giant, undeniable timeline. Side by side, the entire auditorium saw the exact timestamps of my desperate voice messages pleading for a rescue helicopter, directly juxtaposed with the digital banking receipts. The massive screen showcased his cruel, precise transfers of exactly $100, accompanied by his typed memos telling me to stop lying and not to ruin his party. A wave of profound disgust swept through the crowd. Investors began whispering furiously, pulling out their phones. Julian looked as though all the oxygen had been violently sucked from his lungs. His confident posture collapsed entirely. "This is the man you are about to trust with your billions." I spoke directly into my microphone, my voice steady, analytical, and completely devoid of mercy. A man who mocked his dying wife for exactly $100 while she was trapped in the snow. But his profound moral bankruptcy is not the reason you will all pull your funding today. I pressed the remote one final time. The screen flashed with the stark, imposing seal of a federal judge. "I am officially announcing an emergency federal court injunction, filed this morning alongside the General Counsel of Vespera Dynamics," I declared, staring directly at the front row of venture capitalists. "Every single line of source code Julian is presenting to you today is entirely stolen intellectual property." Right on cue, the back-heavy oak doors of the auditorium burst open. A tactical unit of Federal Bureau of Investigation agents flooded into the aisles, their golden badges flashing brilliantly under the house lights. Pandemonium erupted. Sloan Mercer attempted to slip away behind the digital presentation podium, but two federal agents grabbed her arms, forcefully slamming heavy steel handcuffs around her wrists. She shrieked wildly, her perfectly curated facade shattering completely as she was loudly informed of her immediate arrest for attempted murder and massive financial fraud. Julian stood frozen, utterly paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his absolute destruction. His phone buzzed continuously with automated alerts. Red downward arrows flashed across the financial terminals of every single mobile device in the room as institutional investors instantaneously dumped his stock. Within mere seconds, his massive net worth evaporated into absolute zero. His company was bankrupt, and he was staring directly at a lengthy federal prison sentence for harboring a fugitive and covering up millions in stolen funds. In the utter chaos of fleeing investors and shouting financial reporters, Julian collapsed. His knees hit the hard stage floor with a sickening thud. He crawled toward me like a pathetic animal, his hands desperately clutching the hem of my winter coat, his eyes wide with absolute terror and disbelief. I looked down at the broken man crying at my feet. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I slowly reached into my pocket and pulled out one final, perfectly crisp $100 bill. I leaned down and forcefully shoved the green paper deep into the breast pocket of his expensive tailored suit. "You once said my mother and I were your absolute worst return on investment," I whispered, my cold voice cutting cleanly through his pathetic sobbing. "Congratulations, Julian. Today, you are officially bankrupt." I forcefully pulled my coat from his desperate grasp. I turned my back and walked away, the heavy rhythmic thud of my wooden crutches echoing in perfect harmony with the blinding flash of dozens of press cameras. I walked out of the massive hall and into the freezing Denver air, leaving the rotten king completely buried in the exact ruins he had built. Thank you so much for listening to my story until the very end. Where are you listening from today? I would love to know. If you found today's story powerful, please consider helping us with just a $1 donation. You can simply scan the QR code on your screen or use the donation link in the video description or pinned comment. Your generous support allows us to pay our dedicated staff, help them feed their families, and continue creating these incredible stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.